In one regard, of all the important things that we've looked at in the history of the church during the first millennium of the church's history, perhaps the most defining event, characteristic, activity, has been that of evangelism. There has never been a time when there was such widespread evangelism. Now, I'm going to say that today there are probably more people being converted, but then there are more people in the world. But as far as the geographic spread, going into areas that were previously pagan, it was indeed the primary activity of that millennium, that first millennium. And remember that we started when Christianity was still being persecuted. Jesus had said to his disciples, "You are to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the uttermost part of the world." And we can see, as you remember back to our first study in the book of Acts, that the gospel did begin in Jerusalem, went out to Judea, went to Samaria through Philip, went then out into Asia Minor, and then Europe through the work of the Apostle Paul. But then the record stops, and we don't know as much because we don't have that careful record of an evangelist's activities such as Luke gives us of the Apostle Paul. And yet, I want you to understand, in spite of the fact that our sources are somewhat limited, we can put the picture together and see that it was a time of very effective and prolific evangelism. Now, right after the death of the apostles and the record ending in the book of Acts, we believe that most of the missionary activity was done not by missionaries themselves who were sent out, but by what we might call just one-on-one evangelism. People sharing the gospel with their friends and their neighbors. This would seem to be what's happening. That on the street, Christians were so filled with the love of God and so excited about their salvation that they shared it with their pagan neighbors, in their businesses, and wherever they encountered people. And this seems to be the way that it spread, not through evangelistic revival services in church. It wasn't that they had crusades, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a great crusade or evangelistic revival, but that didn't seem to be what happened. It was just people telling other people about Jesus, and it worked. And the gospel began to spread, and conversions began to happen everywhere. Now, it started primarily in the cities, and I think you can understand why, because people are in closer contact with each other in the cities, and communication is much easier, and probably people in the city are more receptive to new ideas than in the country. And converting country people was later. They were the most resistant, because country people are conservative. Now, when we talk conservative in this context, we're talking about being pagan conservative. And they held on to their pagan ways. And so it took a while before the gospel spread out into the country, and country folk were converted. And that's why the word pagan itself, in Latin, pagani, means country. The people of the country. The pagani were the last ones to be converted. But eventually that will happen. And so thousands and thousands of people were converted by Christians whose witness is unrecorded and whose names we will never know this side of eternity. But how glorious it'll be in heaven when we'll find all of that out. And even though we don't have a tremendous amount of just specific information about particular missionaries, we can put together a pretty good picture, because some missionaries did indeed go out and were responsible for going into areas that had been untouched thus far by the gospel, and indeed did accomplish much by the grace and help of God. Probably the earliest one that we can bear record to would be Gregory Thaumaturgus, who was living up in Pontus, which is in the north part of Anatolia. That's now Turkey, near the Black Sea, across the sea from Russia. And that was a pagan area. And Gregory converted many people there. Apparently he worked miracles. And it was these miracles that drew people's attention to the gospel, much in the same way that we find Philip and others, even Paul, working miracles in the Bible times. At least that's the record that we have. He was a well-educated person. He had been taught by Origen, and if you remember our study of the early Christian writers, I told you that Origen was the greatest of the fathers in the East. Origen was certainly well-educated. A little bit strange on his theology, but well-educated. And so Gregory had studied under Origen, and he later became the bishop of Neo-Caesarea. Another early missionary will be familiar to you all, I believe. Patrick. We all know about St. Patrick's Day on March 17th. And we know that Patrick converted what nation? Ireland, yes. Ireland to Christianity. And he seems to have been really an historical figure, and he seems to have been primarily responsible for the conversion of Ireland. Now, he didn't come from Ireland originally. He was British. He came from the island of, what we say, England, Britain. And he actually was captured when he was a boy by Irish slave traders and was taken as a slave, to Ireland where he lived. And somewhere along the way, he was converted, and he in turn then converted large numbers of people in Ireland and baptized them. He then established monasteries in Ireland, and you see the beginning of a tradition of monasteries in these regions. Now, these regions of Ireland, Scotland, Britain before the Anglo-Saxon invasions, Wales, Brittany in France, were Celtic areas. And in these Celtic areas, the monasteries that were established were centers not only of evangelism, they were centers of evangelism, but they were centers of learning as well. Remember, we talked about monasteries in an earlier study. And in the next study, which will be the last one in this series of history of the earliest church, and then we're going to move to the medieval church. But in that next study, next time, I want us to talk about the Celtic church. It's a fascinating story about a different church, not Roman Catholic, not Eastern Orthodox, but Celtic. The next great missionary that we want to look at is Columba. Columba went to Scotland from Ireland. Once Ireland had become converted, then Columba took the gospel to Scotland and established a monastery on an island just off the coast of Scotland at Iona. And this was the base of operations then for the mainland. And later, Christianity will spread from Scotland southward into pagan Anglo-Saxon England. Again, we'll talk more about that in the next study. And another missionary who accomplished a tremendous amount by God's grace was a man named Ulfilas. He's a German. That means little wolf in German, in the old German. And like many of the Germans, he was at the beginning an Arian, not a Nicene Christian or Orthodox Christian, if you please, who believed in the divinity of Christ and understanding that Christ is God. Now, Arians, of course, didn't see themselves as heretics, but as we have studied, the councils defined Arianism as heresy. And yet, many of the Goths, most of the Goths, were at the beginning Arians. Gradually, they were converted to Nicene Christianity. But in spite of the fact that Ulfilas had some theological problems, he was a zealous missionary. He lived between 311 and 383 in the 4th century. And he converted a huge number of the Goths. Not only converted them, but he did something that missionaries will do when they are in a place like the German culture, and we'll see that later in reference to the Slavic culture, where the people don't know how to write. They have a spoken language, but they have no written language. At that time, the Germans didn't have a written language. Now, if you're a missionary, you want them to read the Bible. You want to be able to give them religious literature, but they can't read. So you've got to teach them how to read and write. And so what Ulfilas did is invent a Gothic alphabet. And he did. That's the old Gothic script that when I first studied German, I had to read in the Gothic script. But it really started with, of course, modification through the years with Ulfilas. And he translated the Bible into Gothic. In time, of course, gradually, and over the next couple of centuries, the Arian Germans were converted to Nicene Christianity, to Orthodox Christianity, Little O Orthodox Christianity. That happened in Spain. Spain was German. Spain was Visigothic German. Visigoths were West Germans. They settled in Spain about 415. And they were Arians at the first, but by 589, their king, Recared, was converted to Nicene Christianity. Now, the Spanish, from the very beginning, have been intense with their Christianity. They were intense with Arian Christianity, then they were intense with Orthodox Christianity. And the same thing happened in Burgundy. Burgundians are Germans also. Burgundy is that area that lies between France and Germany, that middle territory around the city of Strasbourg, extending from about Geneva, Switzerland, on up into the Low Countries, actually into Holland and Belgium. And that area was also Arian to begin with, but then the Burgundian king Sigismund in 516 accepted the Nicene faith. However, in France, the story was a little different. Franks were also Germans, but they never were Arians, because they weren't converted until Arianism was beginning to decline. And the Franks hadn't even come together as a nation until the reign of Clovis, the time of Clovis. Clovis is the first historical figure in French history. He's the first French king. Clovis was converted to Christianity, but to Roman Christianity, to Nicene Christianity from the very beginning. He marched his army down to the river on Christmas Day and in 496 and had them all baptized, and thus France became Christian. But from the beginning, France is tied by government. The government, it's a state religion, and the religion is tied to the state, and also that state is tied very closely to the Roman Church. And while we're talking about the German civilization here, understand that most of Western Europe, which was once a part of the Roman Empire, became German. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the government collapsed, really in the 4th and 5th centuries, German tribes came in to take over Western Europe. And they will split Western Europe up into various Germanic states. And so we have Spain, and France, and Burgundy, and Germany, and England, actually 7 English states. All of these nations are growing out of the chaos that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. And what is really interesting about these states of Europe, which are the states of modern Europe, is that the beginning of their existence as a nation coincides with the beginning of Christianity among those people, which means they did not have a history that was pre-Christian. They had no pagan history as a nation. Now, as a people, yes, but not as a nation. So from the beginning of their nations were Christian nations. And so when we study the history of France, the history of Spain, the history of Germany, the history of England, England being somewhat of an exception to that, but certainly on the continent, it is a history of a Christian nation, a Christian civilization. Now, one area we've not discussed would be the north part of that Burgundian area, that middle kingdom, which is the Netherlands, Holland, if you please. They were inhabited by people known as Frisians. Frisians speak a German dialect that is called Niederdeutsch, Low German, and so they are a little different from the rest of the Germans. It was Willibrord who went to the Frisians and was supported by the Pope and by the Franks. Now, Willibrord is an interesting missionary. He came from Saxon Northumberland. Northumberland, first of all, was not even settled by Saxon people, but by Angles, but there was an area in Northumberland that was Saxon. But Willibrord himself did not share in the religion of the Saxons, which at that time was pagan. He was a Celtic Christian. He was a member of this Celtic church, and yet he was living in Northumberland. He seems to be a real man of the world. And so even though he is a member of the Celtic church and not of the Roman church, technically, he wanted to be a missionary, and the Pope supported him. And the Franks, who were Roman Catholics, supported him. And he went to the Netherlands to preach there, and the Pope made him the first Archbishop of Utrecht in 695 or 696. He then founded the monastery of Echternach in Luxembourg, which became a great missionary center. Now, Luxembourg is today a separate nation in Europe, a small country. Today, if you go to Luxembourg, the official language is French, but the people living in Luxembourg still speak a Germanic language, and so there are ties to their Germanic past. These Celtic areas, even the Celtic area in Northumberland, were always, as I've said, well-educated, very zealous, and produced many, many missionaries. Another one, and perhaps the most famous missionary of all of the early Middle Ages, was a man whose real name is Winfrith, but he took the name Boniface. Boniface in Latin means doer of good. He was born about 672, somewhere in there, and died in 754. He was a monk. He was a scholar. He worked first with the Frisians and then with Germans in the Rhine area. Now, this area of the Rhine was the heartland of Germany in one sense, and was the heartland of the pagan resistance among the Germans. That is, they were about the last ones to be converted. And Boniface was willing to go into that territory to take the gospel. Again, he was also supported by the Pope, and he wrote letters to the Pope regularly to keep him informed about the progress of his missionary work. Gave him reports continually, and you know those letters have been kept. We have the letters of Boniface, and it's fascinating to read those letters today as he gives these reports about the preaching and how the preaching is going and how the work is going. It's just fascinating. And Boniface will be very successful. He will convert many, many people. And Boniface is bringing together these Celtic church forms and Roman church forms. Because obviously, on the missionary field, as we see today, out on the missionary field, what denomination you're a member of is not relevant. Back in America, one can argue with his religious neighbors about doctrinal differences, but when you get out on the mission field, that's not important. What's important is that we are Christians, and missionaries tend to work very closely with missionaries from other denominations. And I think the same thing is happening here. Out on the mission field in Saxony, among the pagans, it wasn't so important whether you were Celtic or you were Roman. The fact is, you're a Christian. Boniface was educated at Exeter, and he loved learning, and he loved adventure, and he loved action, and he certainly got it in his lifetime. His life story is fascinating. He was the son of a missionary, came from a missionary family. He left England in 718, and he never returned. His most successful work was at Hesse in Thuringia, right in the heartland of Germany. The most dramatic moment, and perhaps one of the most dramatic moments in the experience of any missionary that we know of, was an incident that occurred in Hesse at a place called Geismar. It is told by Boniface's biographer, Willibald. Boniface, who was never afraid of confronting the opposition and who would jump right into the heart of things, knew that he had to destroy the people's confidence in the pagan religion. Now, you all know what religion the Germans believed in at this time? Thor, god of thunder, Odin, the Valkyries, the witches, the trolls, 12 gods and 12 goddesses. It was a well-defined mythology. And these gods were filled with action and lust and violence and reflected the lives of many of these people. But people held strongly to the pagan religion, the Norse religion it's often called, same as you'd find up among the Vikings in Scandinavia. He knew that he had to break the back of the pagan religion and make it obvious. So he went to the most sacred place in that area in Hesse, and it was in a grove of trees. Most of these pagans worship in groves of trees. And they would designate certain trees that were sacred. And they would gather around these trees to offer their worship and go through their rituals. There was an oak tree at Geismar that was sacred to Thor. And Boniface knew that he had to deal with that oak tree, and all these pagan priests of Thor are standing around, and this big crowd is gathered, and he says, I am going to cut this tree down. And the priest says, you cut that tree down, and Thor will send his lightning bolt and strike you dead. I'm going to read from the account by Willibald, and I quote, a great crowd of pagans stood by watching and bitterly cursing in their hearts the enemy of the gods. But when he, that is Boniface, had made a superficial cut, suddenly the oak's vast bulk, shaken by a mighty blast of wind from above, crashed to the ground, shivering its topmost branches into fragments in its fall, as if by the express will of God, for the brethren present had done nothing to cause it. The oak burst asunder into 4 parts, each part having a trunk of equal length. At the sight of this extraordinary spectacle, the heathens who had been cursing ceased to revile and began, on the contrary, to believe and to bless the Lord. And after that, there were many conversions. And Boniface determined to make this a Christian center, so he built a monastery at Fulda nearby there in Hesse. He continued to keep in constant touch with the Pope, furthered good relations with the Pope, and let him know exactly what was happening. Boniface was a moral man, a gentle man, and yet very firm. His sincerity was impeccable. His life came to an end on June the 5th, 754, in Frisia. He'd gone back to Frisia to work there up in the north, and a band of pagan warriors swooped down upon him and his company and massacred them, and they took his library and threw it to the winds. But we're glad that the letters that he wrote to other people were preserved, and perhaps after the death of Boniface, those letters were even more carefully preserved. Charlemagne finished the work of conversion in this area among the Saxons, often converting people by force and putting people to death who resisted, but he did send out missionaries to teach people. In England, we'll talk more about England in our next study. The first of the Anglo-Saxon kings to be converted was the King of Kent, Ethelbert of Kent. In Rome, the Pope was Gregory the Great, and the story goes that Gregory was walking through the marketplace in Rome one day and encountered some slave boys. They were about to be sold into slavery. And he inquired about these boys. He said, who are they? And his associate said, they are Angles. He said, Angles? They look like angels. They were beautiful children. And he said, tell me, are they Christian? No, they are not. They are pagan. Then we must send the gospel to the land of the Angles. And so the Pope sent a missionary named Augustine, not the writer of the City of God, but having the same name, and 40 monks, about the same time that Ethelbert is being converted, and so Augustine and his 40 monks will work to convert pagan England to Christianity. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and from that day until this day, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the head official of the English Church, head cleric of the English Church. The story of conversions among the Angles and Saxons is recorded by the historian the Venerable Bede, who lived between 672 and 735, in his Ecclesiastical History of the English-Speaking People, which my professor in graduate school said, and I quote, it is unquestionably the finest piece of historical writing in the early Middle Ages. Ansgar, living 801 to 865, who was a Saxon, and it's so interesting because you see how the gospel went really from Celtic area to England, England over to Germany, and now the Germans become missionary centers, sending out missionaries to Scandinavia. And so one place that once was pagan, once converted, now becomes a missionary center. And so the Saxon area is now a missionary center, and Ansgar was sent out by Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, to Scandinavia. Actually, he had lived in Picardy and was a monk at Corbie in France. He went to Westphalia, then on to Denmark. He established a school in Schleswig, which is just south of Denmark, then went into Sweden. He was appointed Bishop of Hamburg in 848, and the first Archbishop of Bremen. He returned to Denmark and converted Erik, the king of Jutland. Now notice how our dates are getting later now. And you see that the last area is going to be Scandinavia. Scandinavia was not fully converted until the 10th to 12th century. Alfred the Great, the first king of United England, required a Danish leader to be converted, and many Danes accepted Christianity as a result. Canute, who was king of England between 1017 and 1035, and was also king of Denmark and of Norway, and was a Christian, will influence the Danes. The Viking Duke of Normandy in 911 was forced to be baptized in order to be able to assume control of Normandy. Norway was Christian by 995 through two kings, Olaf Tryggvason, 995 to 1000, and Olaf Haraldsson, 1015 to 1030. Greenland and Iceland in the 11th century, and Sweden by the 12th century. The first Christian king there was Olaf Lopking, who was baptized in 1007, and that conversion of the king is manifested in the building of a beautiful cathedral at Uppsala. Among the Slavic people, Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev, was the first in Russia to become a Christian. Kiev was the first Russian state, and it was established in 862. In 989, Vladimir, tired of being a pagan when everybody else around him was Christian, selected Orthodox Christianity, not Catholic, but Orthodox Christianity, and thus Russia, from the beginning of its Christian existence, has been Orthodox. However, Stephen, the king of the Magyars, was converted in 997 to Roman Christianity, Roman Catholic Christianity, and the Magyars, of course, are Hungarians, and so Hungary became a Christian nation in 997. Cyril and Methodius, two brothers, went from Constantinople to East Europe. These two brothers were devout and capable missionaries. They went to Moravia, they went to Serbia in the Balkans, they went to Russia, they went to Bulgaria, and they also found a people with no written alphabet, no way to write. And so they created an alphabet for the Slavic people. What they did is to take the Greek alphabet, which was their alphabet since they were Greek-speaking from Constantinople. They took the Greek alphabet and remodeled it and created new letters where they needed it for sounds that were not in Greek for the Slavic people. And the result is what's known as the Cyrillic alphabet, named after Cyril, which the Russians still use, and which the people in Slavic-speaking areas, for the most part, still use. Now, there was much rivalry between East and West, and I've suggested to you before that rivalry is not a bad thing. Competition is good in business, and competition was good for the proclamation of the gospel, because here you have two churches, the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, and they're both wanting to convert Eastern Europe. And here's this big rush, each church trying to convert Eastern Europe to its form of Christianity. And really the competition spurred on the evangelistic activity. It was the Orthodox who converted most of Eastern Europe, but there were several areas in Eastern Europe that did become Roman Catholic, such as Hungary, such as the Czech areas, and Poland. Christianity spread by the Germans into Poland, and that's why it was Roman. The Knights of the Sword and the Teutonic Knights converted Prussia, Estonia, and Latvia. The Finns were converted by the Swedes through conquest. Just to sum this up now, it took a long time for Europe to be converted. Sometimes it was by conquest. It was forcible conversion. Sometimes it was through the preaching of the gospel by missionaries. And we would ask questions like, how effective was evangelism by conquest? How real, then, was Christianity that was imposed upon pagan beliefs? How sincere were these people? And these are legitimate questions for us to raise, but we need to think also that however it happened, it happened. And Europe became Christian. And Europe created, by the help of God, a Christian civilization that endured for a millennium and is responsible for Christianity spreading out of that context to everywhere else in the world. And so the debt that Christians everywhere are going to owe today to what was going on in Europe then, ultimately, of course, glory to God for it, but as God uses people, it was Europe that became the center of Christianity and the source for the evangelizing of the rest of the world.